Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. It's probably a good idea to start this episode with a content warning. I'm personally comfortable with this content, but I've seen so many different reactions to this issue that I don't want to blindside anyone. So I will preface this by saying I am not against extreme protest, and I actually believe it has a place in the protest toolkit. My warning before I start is less about any sort of content I'll be discussing, and more about the fact that I won't be disparaging it, discouraging it, or trying to frame it as a mental illness or something unthinkable or evil that should be avoided at all costs. If the idea of an exploration of self-immolation in a way that doesn't condemn it is not something you're comfortable with, then I won't be put out if you stop listening right now and go find some other content that is better suited to you. No harm, no foul, you're not a bad person, I wish you well. Feel free to come by next episode when I'll be talking about something entirely different. For those of you still here, let's get into today's episode. Early in December 2023, I saw an article about a person who self-immolated in front of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. I remember the incident because it was the first time I'd seen self-immolation in the news in years. And I'll talk a little bit about some assumptions I made that I later found out to be erroneous. My first assumption was why? The circumstances may seem to point to a motive, but if the person provided an explicit statement, it's been suppressed. And I'll explain why I believe that more than I believe that there was no statement later on. My second assumption was that the person who did this was a man. They were not. My final assumption was that they died. They did not. Or at least the only reporting to date says they survived it. And since this story has been suppressed, there's no way to know if they continue to survive. It may be surprising to some younger listeners, but self-immolation was in the news quite a lot as a method of protest when I was much younger. I only remembered it was tied to the oppression of Tibet by China, and most of the people doing it were Buddhist monks. But if you asked me why it was happening, I couldn't have told you other than some sort of regional oppression by China. When I saw the incident in December, I posted to social media that I had not heard of this in years, and I wondered if it would catch on, like it had with Buddhist monks in Tibet, and I'll explain a bit more about that as we go on. After the December report, however, I didn't think any more about it. Fast forward to the end of February, and Bushnell is in the news, having self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Since the earlier incident was less than 3 months before, I wanted to tie it into my post about Bushnell. So I Googled to get the name of the protester who had done it in December. And this is where things started to unravel. Self-immolation is not something we see every day. A person setting themselves on fire in broad daylight on a public street, especially in front of an important diplomatic nexus like an embassy or a consulate, tends to be noticed. It gets people's attention. That's a big part of the point of extreme protest, to bring attention to an issue that is often perceived as being ignored. It's like a scream of frustration at a lack of urgency in a situation the protester finds urgent. One of my areas of specialization in college was communications, the journalism and editorial track. So I'm not a novice when it comes to what types of things make headlines. But you don't have to have a journalism degree to recognize that an event like this should be expected to attract reporters descending on this story like a swarm of locusts. They would be apologizing for images we're about to see, interviewing anyone who witnessed it, reporting anything the protester had said or done, their history, their online activity, horrifically putting microphones and cameras in the faces of family and coworkers, camping out at the hospital waiting for reports, basically reporting every gory detail. And I would expect there to be a load of witnesses on a weekday in the afternoon in a location with businesses and a consulate. I expected a lot of what we saw with Aaron Bushnell's protest. Media would be looking at all angles: family members, friends, teachers, co-workers, people who work at the embassy or consulate, even passers-by or others who may have been there protesting with her. With so many people coming and going, there are a load of journalistic angles to cover for an incident like this. But there was nothing. And that is inexplicably strange. And there was no published explanation given for why there was nothing. Not only was media not reporting, not only was no one speaking out, but no one was explaining why it was being suppressed. But make no mistake, this story has been suppressed. And I want to be clear, I don't know why. I will give some thoughts on it, but in the end, I can't say that I have any evidence outside of what I'll discuss for why I have the opinions I do. I went searching for an identity, and I found the original articles, and that was it. It was like, this was a thing that happened today, and that was the end of it. And that is absolutely not normal for reporting on an extreme event that basically never happens. It's fishy as fuck. In addition to there being zero reporting on witness accounts, there was no name, no details about the protester, no race, no age, no indication where they were from, almost no gender, with many reputable outlets referring to the protester as they, them. As an aside, I had a chuckle at the use of they, them to erase the person's identity. Whenever I read articles about trans issues, the idea of using they, them to refer to someone is often considered controversial, with a lot of outlets misgendering people on purpose. But in this case, the use of they, them was clearly used to hide any hint of the identity of the protester. This wasn't just a disappointment. It was a media blackout. And not just a media blackout, but a very scary media blackout. Before I get into what I found, I want to insert an addendum here. What I'm saying now was added after I had recorded the episode. I was choosing the quote to use with the episode thumbnail on YouTube, and I decided to use Aaron Bushnell's final statement. In the attribution, I was simply going to use his name and his birth date and death date. I was not able to do that, however, because there's a media blackout surrounding his birthday. So I can only put the year 1998. Unlike other public figures, both celebrated and notorious, his birthday has been erased. And the one thing I can guess is that the folks who erased it were afraid his birthday would be commemorated. In some social media threads, there were claims that he died on his birthday, but I found nothing to substantiate that. Is it really feasible that a man who was enlisted in the U.S. military existed without any living person being able to provide his birthday? Friends, family, medical records, military records, school records. And just like with the story I'm about to tell, I can't even find an explanation. So we're left to assume and never know. But back to the woman who self-immolated in December. The little bits I can piece together go something like this. The Associated Press says it happened on a Friday afternoon, and that a security guard was injured when they intervened. The guard is also a mystery in the AP reporting, and this is where I dispelled the assumption that the protester died. They were, in fact, hospitalized in critical condition. The reporting was that they were at the consulate in Atlanta with a Palestinian flag. The article said that nothing about the incident appeared to be tied to terrorism or threats to anyone in the consulate. AP noted that authorities did not release the protesters' name, age, or gender. But again, you don't need that information from authorities because on a Friday afternoon in front of an international consulate, you'd have witnesses. We know there was at least one security guard involved. Are we supposed to believe that no one was driving by? There were no bystanders? No one saw this incident? Because that's unbelievable. Not in the hyperbolic way, but in the way that conveys that this is too much for anyone to actually believe. I don't need a report from authorities for something this outrageous that happened in a place so public on a weekday afternoon. There are witnesses to this out there. Someone admitted them to a hospital. Many people must have been involved in their immediate medical treatment and long-term care. Authorities didn't just not release the information. Authorities did something that should chill us all. They somehow got every single person directly involved and also every passerby, every innocent bystander, everyone even indirectly involved to say nothing about what they witnessed. And they did it so well that to this day, at the end of April as I'm scripting this, none of the many people who had to have witnessed this event have said a word or been interviewed or even provided anonymous statements. This is a media blackout. The other popular wire service, Reuters, reported that it happened at 12:17 in the afternoon, the time I would expect folks to be leaving the building for lunch. Reuters noted that in addition to the consulate, there are several other businesses housed in the same office complex. Again, how do you get every single witness to say nothing? This report says that the person used gasoline and that a statement from the Consul General of Israel attributed the event to hate. However, I have seen zero indication of motivation outside of the mention of the flag that was said to have been at the scene. Don't get me wrong, my goal is not to gaslight people. When I heard about this back in December, my assumption was that this was a person protesting the U.S. involvement in the massacres live streaming out of Gaza. But as I searched for information, there was no reporting on the person's intentions. But that was another assumption that I wasn't able to verify. Did the Consul General know something we didn't? Did the protester shout anything, leave a note or a manifesto? There's no way to know. Maybe he was assuming just as I did. Maybe he has information he's not sharing. We just don't know. I know The Guardian has taken hits in recent years as going more mainstream, but I still see them pushing back against status quo narratives now and then. In this case, they offered no more investigative journalism than any other outlet. They refer to the person only as the protester. I finally caught a small break when I stumbled upon a piece put out by Fox Channel 5 in Atlanta. For folks who aren't familiar with Fox in the U.S., this isn't really the main Fox News channel that you hear so much about that hosts all the right-wing conservative propaganda. Fox has a number of local news outlets that are basically just local news, weather, sports, and so on. Nothing all that political or editorial. Mainly just the events of the day. And that's what Fox 5 in Atlanta would be. Their headline gave away more than any of the other journalistic reporting I could find. It read, "Pro-Palestine demonstrators horrified by woman setting self on fire outside Israeli consulate." So the headline hints at protesters in the plural, which is not surprising at an Israeli consulate in December 2023. And it also gives a gender. It was a woman who had done it. Now, to be fair, the article talks about protesters flooding the area the weekend after the event, and it's possible they were saying that it was protesters coming later who were horrified, but I stick to my reasoning that a consulate would attract protesters. I would be completely stunned if I were to learn that this woman was the only one in the vicinity on a Friday afternoon. However, this Fox article also provides the name of the security guard who was injured, Michael Harris. His wife spoke to Fox and said it was going to be a long road to recovery since his injuries were severe. Fox even featured live televised segments with updates on his recovery. They said that while he wasn't ready to talk publicly, his family said he was making progress. And again, this makes my point. I can totally understand that a family wouldn't want to talk about a personal tragedy. I can understand the person or witness not wanting to talk about it. But erasing an identity from all media for such a public incident is an intentional media blackout. There are just too many people involved to be able to hide the identity like this without significant effort to do so. Police reports, for example, are almost always public record. In follow-up reports about 2 weeks after the event, Fox is no longer using gender pronouns to describe the protester, and instead of woman, they are saying someone and using they, them over she, her. In trying to find more information, I came up with precious little else. There was a brief mention in one thread where someone said they had heard she was a black woman, but I was unable to find any indication of race anywhere to confirm that. Then I found a tweet by an account labeled, "Read, let this radicalize you." It was written shortly after the news of Bushnell's self-immolation was reported. And it said, quote, "Losing my mind right now. After today's self-immolation, I just spent the last hour trying to figure out what happened to the woman who self-immolated outside the Israeli consulate in Atlanta in December. I can't even find her name." Unquote. Then I found a tweet from an account for Stephen W. Day from December 5th, where a December 2nd tweet was shared out. The December 2nd tweet said, "Pro-peace in Palestine protester immolates themselves in Atlanta. My piece on the subject," unquote, with a link included to something that account, Sam Husseini, had created. The account sharing it, Stephen Day, said, quote, "Sam, do you have contacts in Atlanta activist community? Someone who can go to Grady Memorial Hospital to identify the woman who self-immolated? Was she Palestinian? Did she have family in Gaza? It is important to say her name and tell her story," unquote. And I agree, it's important to share her story. There is something very viscerally inhuman in treating something so desperate as though it never happened. To ignore it, to refuse to acknowledge it, that act is a scream so loud that to silence it is a crime against our own humanity. If we let her actions, her sacrifice go unnoticed and unacknowledged, what does that say about us and the level of cruelty we're capable of? If nothing else, I want to know who silenced her screams. I want to know why. Was it out of fear that this might catch on? Was it because it was such an impactful sacrifice and it might set fire to a movement that is already growing in momentum? We saw what happened right after Aaron Bushnell. If I were that desperate to make my point that I was willing to draw attention to it with my own death in such an extreme and horrifying fashion, how would I feel to know that my government and fellow citizens didn't even acknowledge it happened? That they made sure that my name and my voice were stripped of a platform or any potential attention? I can't even imagine the cruelty of a regime that could ignore that level of suffering and self-sacrifice. But this is the USA, where shooting up a mall or a church or a schoolhouse is just Tuesday, I suppose. I would note that for a while there was a trend to not use shooters' names in order to reduce copycat incidents, spurred on by attention and glorification of the act, which was seen as negative and destructive for obvious reasons. But whether self-immolation is negative and destructive has everything to do with observer perspective. That is, whether the observer sees it as a mere act of self-destruction or as an act of self-sacrifice done to bring attention to a worthy cause. Is it a wasted life or a meaningful death? Is it a sign of someone with nothing to live for, or of someone who has found something they believe is worth dying for? My goal here is not to change anyone's mind on this topic. It's not to promote it or glorify it. But I'm also not going to vilify it. I will only say that, to me, ignoring a human being who has been burned alive, whether they did it to themselves or not, is as close as I, as an atheist, can come to viewing something as a sin. I want to know what they had to say. They sacrificed so much to give voice to their views. How could I treat their message as not even worthy of a hearing? To take their sacrifice and do all you can to ensure the reason they did it never sees the light of day is, for me, an act of extreme inhumanity, a cold-blooded lack of basic human compassion. Looking back on the rash of self-immolations from my youth, I couldn't help but wonder if the White House wasn't shutting this down on purpose to avoid the PR nightmare that they'd have on their hands if U.S. citizens began setting fire to themselves in the streets with some frequency. Too often it feels like our government believes that if it simply ignores a problem, it'll blow over and go away in the next 24-hour news cycle. That was a tactic Trump perfected. And it does seem we've gotten used to some horrifying things as a society. Housing and food insecurity, mass shootings, people dying because they can't afford medical care, the impact of systemic oppression on community after community after community. Even the planet slowly cooking to death, we shrug and tell ourselves that mundane life must go on as we're headed for the cliff we've all been assured is coming. In light of that last one, it's hard to see how anything could possibly matter. And yet here I am, scripting a podcast, feeding my cats, working full-time for an employer, renewing my car registration, paying my taxes, because human beings really can ignore a lot of shit. A friend of mine asked me why more protesters aren't self-immolating. At first blush, it seems like an odd question, because the prospect of burning alive is so horrifying to most of us that we don't like to even think about it as an accidental potentiality, let alone intentional, and by our own hand. But the strange fact is there is some evidence that this form of protest, like a lot of things that horrify us, can be infectious. The reason I recalled this from my younger days wasn't because I saw it once. It was because I actually used to see it quite a lot. It's interesting that as the trend eventually faded, I seem to have forgotten the news reports on each new incident. Kind of like when I was researching the protest bombings in the 1960s and 70s of the Weather Underground. I began to recall that was a lot more common in the U.S. than I remembered. Although the self-immolation incidents were happening in Tibet, they were on the news in the U.S. pretty often. I found a research paper about it when I was looking up the information on why this was happening so much back in the day. It's titled Tibetan Buddhist Self-Immolation, and is a brief summary, only several pages long, giving a basic rundown of what I'd been watching on the nightly news so many years ago. Apparently, these incidents started around 2009 in modern Tibet. And by the time the paper had been written in 2015, there were 146 incidents reported. According to Wikipedia, the current figure is 160. What triggered this first incident was violent repression by China of peaceful protests by Buddhist monks the prior year, 2008, at the Kirti Monastery. There had been a large wave of protests happening around this one, as the 2008 Olympics were set to be held in Beijing, making China a global focus. But it would be almost a year later, in February 2009, when a 24-year-old monk at the monastery named Taipei self-immolated. The next incident wasn't until 2011, when another monk, Lobsang Phuntssog, chose the anniversary of the Beijing Olympics. 2 monks in the span of 3 years isn't exactly a rash. However, in 2009, there was only the one incident. But in 2011, there were 12 incidents within Tibet, and 2 by Tibetans abroad. In 2012, there were 85 within Tibet and 1 abroad. In 2013, there were 27 in Tibet and 2 abroad. There were 11 in 2014 and 5 in 2015. Most of the protesters were men, and only 120 were confirmed to have died. Those who survived were held in custody in China. But notice that even under state oppression, I'm still able to give you their names. It's extremely odd that this woman in December 2023 has no hint of an identity. When I found the paper, authored by Kevin Carrico, I knew it was what I was looking for because of the compassion with which it was written. He spent an entire paragraph explaining that the pressing question behind these acts, and the one that goes beyond the facts and figures, beyond the numbers, is why. I reached out to Dr. Carrico, but he didn't respond. I don't want to bother him, but he's spoken out through his paper at least, so I will be discussing what he has to say there. When we hear about this happening in Tibet, it's tempting to think that there's some sort of cultural or religious tradition, but that's actually not the case. There is no long-standing tradition of this as a form of protest in Tibet. It's not that there were no instances of it, just nothing we could call common. In fact, in certain contexts, India has more of a historical tradition of this behavior. There was another wave of this type of protest in response to Vietnam, also in Tibet. But there have also been times when someone did this, and it was years later that the next event occurred, which can't really be tied together. The paper goes on to describe a Chinese campaign to wipe out everything about the Tibetan identity: the language, the regional ecosystem, the faith systems, employing forced displacement, even moving Chinese migrant workers into Tibet to change the demographics. In addition to setting up settlements, collective punishment was used against the population of Tibet. Anthropologist Charlene Mackley said, quote, "The military crackdown on Tibetan protest institutionalized the CCP's state of exception in a state of siege, targeting not a specific enemy, but entire towns and districts," unquote. China Central Television showed clips edited to paint the protesters as violent terrorists attacking citizens without provocation. The paper goes on to say, quote, "An already tightly controlled region was quickly transformed into a militarized region, watched over by the omnipresent People's Armed Police," unquote. As I read this, it's difficult not to think about the divestment protests. I have watched hours of footage from many different campuses. I've seen entirely peaceful interfaith activities turn violent only after police showed up and began escalating the situation over banal university restrictions such as bans on standing on a lawn late at night. I watched the protesters respond to the police by going limp and allowing themselves to be dragged off without resistance. I've seen police brutalizing compliant young people and even faculty. One professor had broken ribs and a broken hand for simply filming with his phone. He's beaten even after he's limp on the ground. And he never fights back. At the UCLA Student Press Conference, one divestment protester shows stitches and staples in 2 spots on his head from injuries sustained after counter-protesters attacked the encampment. Again, the divestment protesters put up barriers in order to avoid confrontation, but the counter-protesters worked to violently remove the barriers and even viciously assault anyone who stepped out. The divestment protesters did not engage, and all the while this brutal attack from counter-protesters was happening, the police stood down and did nothing, just watched assault after brutal assault as though they were unable to see what was unfolding before their faces. The police on these campuses are not peacekeepers. They are instigators and enablers of violence that is happening. But U.S. media painted all of this, and continues to paint it, as violence on both sides, or even violence from divestment protesters themselves. I'm shocked when I see the headlines describing the divestment protesters as radicalized and terroristic. When the president stands up and says protest is legal but violence is not protected, he has to know that such statements are going to put these already vulnerable citizen youth in greater danger. He's putting a target on their backs. It reminds me of when Trump described immigrants coming in from Mexico as violent criminals. It stokes the same public vilification that is already happening against these people who just want a better life. Or, in the current case, these young people who are asking their universities to stop profiting so directly from human tragedy and killing. I started to say I was getting off track, but I guess not really, because I'm not sure that it's entirely unrelated to talk about the similarities in situations that spawned similar extreme protests. The middle of last month, April, a man in his late 30s, Max Azzarello, from St. Augustine, Florida, died from injuries after self-immolating in front of a New York court where one of the Trump trials was happening. A brief article at Al Jazeera shows him holding a sign that says, "Trump is with Biden, and they're about to fascist coup us." Before dousing himself in accelerant and setting himself ablaze, he threw pamphlets on the ground that provided his name and a link to some of his writings at a Substack called The Ponzi Papers. There was an NBC article talking about a friend's reaction. His gender is given, his name, his age, where he's from, and links to his blog and papers where he talks about his beliefs about the government. I don't know how long this site will remain up, but I'll include the link for those who wish to read it. I read some of the first page mainly to get an idea of where he was coming from, and he has a lot of thoughts about cryptocurrency and how it's being used to bring down our system. I honestly wasn't able to follow it that well, but I still don't see a reason to silence him. As far as I know then, he is the third person in the U.S. to have self-immolated since early December. That's 3 in 5 months. And again, we have information. We have information on Aaron Bushnell, and we have information on Max Azzarello. The reason we have information on Bushnell and Azzarello is that they learned from the anonymous protester in December. Both Bushnell and Azzarello made sure to create a record of their actions that included information about who they were and why they were doing what they were doing. Whether or not you agree with their reasons or methods, they took steps to make sure they were not erased, that their sacrifices were not for nothing. If their goal was to broadcast a message through their deaths, they succeeded in doing so. What people receiving these messages do with them is up to us. But I'm totally willing to have a look at what they have to say. I want to read an excerpt from Carrico's paper to put this in perspective, starting with the following, quote, "A paradoxical situation has thus emerged in which there are abundant reasons to protest but no effective means to do so. Within this context, self-immolation has emerged as a new form of political protest. Unlike large-scale protests of the type enacted in 2008, self-immolation's instantaneous nature makes it nearly impossible to prevent, despite the authorities' diligent attempts. And unlike individual protests of the type enacted since 2008, its dramatic nature makes self-immolation as political protest an act that cannot be ignored. And most importantly, self-immolation's demonstration of courage represented by a willingness to undergo the most extreme pain for a collective cause, inspires and indeed presses others to take action. Self-immolation in Tibet today is thus less Tibetan Buddhist than simply Tibetan, a product of and response to the current unsustainable socio-political situation in Tibet." Unquote. One of the problems with trying to understand this form of protest is that, as Carrico points out, quote, "the voices of those who have chosen this path of protest are largely missing, precisely on account of their choice of this means of protest. There is thus no easy answer to that most pressing of questions, why? Yet the act itself presses us to rise to the challenge of making sense of an action that is at its heart anything but senseless." Unquote. This was the part of Carrico's paper that resonated with me. If you are the sort of person who can't see the point of this form of protest, I'm not sure honestly that I can help you understand it. But to me, it makes sense as a form of protest. Still reading from the paper, quote, "Robert Barnett observes that the policy response thesis always becomes morally fraught and contentious when it is offered to justify actions which have led to violence against others, as in the case of suicide bombing and other forms of terrorism. By contrast, self-immolation as a means of acting dramatically yet primarily upon oneself and not engaging in a violent manner against others avoids precisely such a moral and political quagmire. Self-immolation is thus an extreme, but still morally and politically powerful means to highlight opposition when no other peaceful means are available. At the same time, although self-immolation acts upon the self, the act itself cannot begin to be explained by individual motivations. Self-immolation is inevitably a social act directed toward collective causes beyond the self, which is destroyed in the act of protest. This is the irony of the term self-immolation in English and zifen, literally self-burning, in Chinese. Both give undue priority to the notion of the self, while the act of self-immolation itself is directed toward broader collective and even inherently selfless causes." End quote. When I was reading Azzarello's online blog, one of the early passages that struck me said, quote, "To my friends and family, witnesses and first responders, I deeply apologize for inflicting this pain upon you, but I assure you it is a drop in the bucket compared to what our government intends to inflict." Unquote. He recognized that it would be disturbing and distressing to some, and he addressed it as well as he could before his passing. Carrico mentions how the image of a person immolating is hard to suppress when you have actual visual of it. It goes viral because it is, as he calls it, an inerasable image. I might call it indelible. Basically, it's not something you forget easily once you've seen it. Something mentioned in the paper as well is that the act is both uncontrollable and disruptive. Quoting again, quote, "In a socio-political situation in which all freedoms have been lost, the ability to sacrifice one's life may be the last freedom that one has. It is a solitary, individual act of protest that can be undertaken in an instant with little chance for the authorities to prevent it or to shut out the protester's message." Unquote. I want to reiterate here that it is all these things combined, and more that I'll talk about, that make silencing these voices so horrifying. It turns an act of selflessness and desperation into one of utter futility in the cruelest way. If I had to guess, I would guess that the protester in December thought that this was a message no one would be able to ignore or erase, and yet it was completely ignored and totally erased. And as a result, those who came after, Bushnell and Azzarello, learned and evolved their methods to avoid that same pitfall. While the cause Bushnell supported has much more broad support than Azzarello's, both men still managed to gain media attention and express statements of motivation that were publicly disseminated. That is, Azzarello's message wasn't so much suppressed as simply unpopular, meaning most people aren't going to relate to it or hear it as something that resonates, but he still got it out successfully. It just wasn't enthusiastically received, and that's never a guarantee. Additionally, as Carrico points out, quote, unlike conventional protests, whose participants can be arrested, suppressed, or disappeared, or a hunger strike which can be forcibly halted by authorities, self-immolation as a means of protest is dramatic, fast, and effectively irreversible, a very visible means of enacting protest when protest is otherwise impossible. Despite repeated attempts, the authorities have been unable to stop these protests or even to capture or punish protesters, causing state agents to engage in such logically perplexing acts as shooting and beating self-immolators while they are in flames, unquote. Carrico also notes something I've observed, that the burning body creates a symbol of the burning issue or the burning state, that like the issue at hand, the person, the protester, is literally on fire. Not in the hey, this is cool sense, but in the urgent and horrifying sense of something like Gaza, where we're watching an entire civilization, an entire society burned to ash. The image Bushnell created was one of a mirror of that reality. I'm not saying that was his intention. I'm saying that as one observer, that was something I saw. Carrico goes on to write that, quote, returning to the question of despair versus resistance raised earlier, the impact, speed, and irreversibility of self-immolation have deeper implications for the fundamental issues of sovereignty and control at the core of current tensions in Tibet. There is no easy way to capture a self-immolator and thus no opportunity for punishment, making self-immolation not only a dramatic but uniquely defiant form of protest. By enacting pain and death, unregulated and uncontrolled by the state, self-immolation exercises a form of power that challenges the state's status as the sole arbiter of life and death. This effectively strips the state of its agency and monopoly of power. Self-immolation is then a bold and fiery reclamation of sovereignty over oneself. Unquote. As Carrico mentions, when the state reacts with violence against a self-immolator, when that image is seen by the public, it's almost absurd. Not everyone may have seen the image that went viral of the officer pointing a gun at Bushnell as he is engulfed in flames. I saw some people trying to justify it, but most people found it utterly perplexing. And here, Carrico is saying it's actually a common state response to try to brutally subdue a person who is literally incapacitated and dying. I actually did not realize until I found this paper that this was a thing. According to the wiki article on Bushnell, the Secret Service officer who first approached Bushnell not only aimed a gun at him, but was repeatedly yelling off camera, "Get on the ground." A police officer yelled back, "I don't need guns, I need fire extinguishers." Bushnell was declared dead later that night. Another reason someone might engage in self-immolation is that people find it hard to look away. And since we are also human, it's hard not to imagine the suffering we're witnessing. With Bushnell, I felt as though he was forcing people to witness the horror that he felt compelled to look at in Gaza. I found it to be both an interesting and effective dynamic for conveying that message of not looking away from horrible suffering. And reaching back to the earlier point of harming the self versus harming others in a protest act like a suicide bombing, Carrico quotes an anonymous commentator who says, We certainly have the courage, and we could take the opportunity to hurt those who deny us freedom by stabbing them, but ours is only a small knife. But instead we have entered the path of not hurting others for the sake of our own freedom, and this is an extraordinary act." Unquote. What I saw in the void Bushnell created when he took away the state's and the media's ability to label him a terrorist was that they tried to undermine him as an unstable individual, an anarchist, a person with a troubled family religious history. They flailed very hard trying to find some way, some label, that would allow people to dismiss what was, to some who witnessed it, a brilliant protest strategy for those who have the fortitude to go that route. It was interesting to me to see the response from people online who, in their ignorance, seemed to promote the idea that this was an isolated act of a mentally unstable individual. Some folks tried to twist some older comments he'd made online into anti-Semitic agendas, and in at least one case, a screenshot was faked in order to try and paint that picture of him. Two very common misfires that I saw were people who promoted memes suggesting Bushnell's actions did nothing to advance his cause, or people who confused this act with a common form of suicide. Often the reports on this event were followed by or paired in some way with suicide hotlines or other support systems, as though Bushnell was in need of mental health services and not thinking clearly and lucidly. Let's look at his story before we go further here. In late February of this year, 2024, Aaron Bushnell, a 25-year-old serviceman in the U.S. Air Force, set himself on fire outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. He had the foresight to record himself before the event, probably aware that another extreme act of protest in December had been successfully erased because there was no record of it. He live-streamed the event on Twitch, and these were his final words, quote, "Hi, my name is Aaron Bushnell. I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I am about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." Unquote. He then arrived at the gate of the embassy, where he put his camera down, doused himself in accelerant, and took out a light. He shouted, "Free Palestine," then ignited himself, repeating "Free Palestine" for as long as he could before going silent. Before doing this, he drafted a will, donating his savings to the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. He even made arrangements for his cat. Before heading out, he made a Facebook post that said, "Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was living during slavery, or the Jim Crow South, or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is, you're doing it right now." Unquote. He alerted media outlets as well with a note saying, "Today I am planning to engage in an extreme act of protest against the genocide of the Palestinian people." A few hours later, he put on his military fatigues and headed out. This is clear and lucid. His actions were very intentional, and I actually don't disagree with anything he said. As far as what he did, I view it very much in the same vein that was expressed by the scholars quoted in Carrico's paper. It's his body, and this was how he chose to exercise his freedom against a state he saw as sponsoring atrocities and horrors. I'm not saying that you have to agree with him. Similar to what I said about Azzarello's message, not everyone will agree or receive it enthusiastically. I think that's something we all know going into any act of protest. People are going to all see it differently. I saw it as bold and courageous, as did a good number of others. Officials in the Palestinian city of Jericho named a street in Bushnell's honor. The website military.com ran an article covering an event in early March. Veteran protesters in Portland, Oregon, set their military uniforms on fire in memoriam of Bushnell's self-immolation. A video was widely shared on social media at the end of February showing a number of protesters in front of a sign that read, quote, "Veterans say, Free Palestine, remember Aaron Bushnell," unquote, as they put their uniforms in a metal drum and set them on fire. In one section of the article, Matt Howard, a Marine Corps veteran, was quoted as saying, quote, "Aaron wore his uniform as he took that act, that ultimate sacrifice. There's obviously an intentional decision that he made, and I think similarly, folks, our members, and other veterans that participated, felt really strongly that that symbolism is important," unquote. Mike Ferner, Director of Veterans for Peace, told The Intercept, quote, "We have been receiving many calls from concerned active duty and recently discharged veterans talking about their personal disgust with our foreign policy in light of recent events, and also talking about how these are affecting them psychologically," unquote. But I also saw from other responses that others had some very different takeaways. But for the people who saw it how I saw it, it was simultaneously inspiring and horrifying. The reaction, I think, I was most confused by was the hypocritical one that was demonstrated more clearly in a post by former House Representative Adam Kinzinger. For folks outside of the U.S., Kinzinger's claim to fame is that he was one of the few conservatives who very late in the game pushed back on Donald Trump. He's still a conservative. On February 26, 2024, just one day after Bushnell's protest, Kinzinger put out a tweet that simply said, "Suicide is not heroic." In response, he was mocked by other accounts that reminded him of a tweet that he had put out almost 2 years to the day on February 25, 2022, in which he had said, quote, "Hero Ukrainian soldier blows himself up to destroy bridge and stop Russian invasion forces storming in from Crimea," unquote, with a link to the full article in The Sun. It reminded me of a presentation I gave once where I pointed out that the story of Samson in the Bible ends with Samson's redemption as he takes down a building in an act of mass murder-suicide that kills 3,000 people. He does it after calling out to God to help him accomplish this act, and according to the story, God helps him. The story is always framed as redemption, that Samson, with this mass murder-suicide, died back in God's good graces, and in my talk I asked, how is this different than what we saw on 9/11? The image we have of 9/11 are men calling out to their God to accomplish a mass murder-suicide in an act of revenge against a state they see as an oppressor. It's literally the story of Samson. But somehow Samson is a hero, or at least is redeemed through this act of what we would label today as extreme terrorism. And this is the same thing Kinzinger has to reconcile. He condemns one man for dying for a cause, but lauds another. Both committed suicidal acts because of their commitment to a cause that they saw as more important than their own lives. A friend of mine commented because he felt his own cognitive dissonance kick in when he saw my post with Kinzinger's tweet and the response tweet calling out Kinzinger with his own words. I wanted to include the comment because, first of all, I'm always impressed when I see someone examine their uncomfortable reactions. And second, it's a testimony of sorts from someone who actually, like Kinzinger, didn't consider these ideas to be at odds until they saw them directly juxtaposed. So I think I will quote my friend here and let him lead us out of this episode with the final word. He wrote, "What's interesting here is that I think I do understand the internal logic that allows this kind of cognitive dissonance to occur, and it's definitely insidious. In the case of the soldier blowing himself up to stop the advancement of an imminent military foe, there is a perceived immediacy to that which forms the justification for the action in question. It's a move that we have seen glorified in the media time and time again. the split-second decision to sacrifice oneself for the greater good in a decisive fashion that saves the day. On the other hand, the idea of sacrificing oneself as a statement of political protest doesn't have that same flavor of urgency nor of importance. And I think that says a lot about the viewer. For one thing, it seems clear that while blowing up the bridge seems immediate and urgent, it's clear that these people still are not perceiving the hundreds of Palestinian civilians dying every day as an urgent problem. They don't see the sacrifice as noble because the goal of preventing innocent deaths among this particular group of people just doesn't have any meaning or importance to them. They literally just don't care. And that is very alarming. Also alarming, I think, is that I think they also don't view political protest as an important feature of democracy. To them, the idea of their own citizens giving them direct feedback about what they should or shouldn't be doing is just an annoyance that they need to sidestep rather than an important engagement by the people that they are supposed to represent. And that's also extremely telling and extremely dismaying. Hundreds of innocent people being wiped out every day. Meh. But keeping that bridge out of enemy hands, now that's hero stuff. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.